All right, so I've been watching Star Trek Strange New Worlds with my family and on my own. And there's something about how it's structured that keeps me coming back to teaching, which is unsurprising. But each episode tells a story. You get a beginning, a middle, an end. You have that closure, satisfaction, resolution. But across the season, the characters are still developing. So, like Captain Pike is growing as a leader. The crew is building relationships. There's a slow burn arc happening underneath the episodic structure. So you get both, right? You get satisfaction each week and that long term character development. And I kept thinking, that's actually what English learning should look like. But that's not what we're being asked to design. I was in this where the facilitator kept saying, once students have mastered identifying theme, then you can move on to how authors develop theme. As if learning is this linear progression where each episode sets up the next, or if you miss episode 2, episode 3 won't make sense. That's not Strange New Worlds. That's serialized TV, where everything builds towards a season finale, where you can't miss an episode. The whole structure depends on that perfect sequential viewing. But that model is exhausting for viewers and for students because, okay, here's what actually happens. Students identify theme in September. That's a complete episode. They leave with something, right? And then they identify theme again in October with a different text, another complete experience, but their thinking has grown. And in January, that same student has a breakthrough about theme that changes how they see everything that came before and everything that will come after. And that's not demonstrating that there was a failure to master it in September. That's character development. That's our students' character development. But we keep being asked to make English learning build up in this perfect linear progression where each lesson scaffolds to the next and everything connects towards some big culminating moment. And I'm frustrated, honestly, because I think we're trying to build up when we really should be building out. I'm Danielle, and today we're talking about why English learning is more like episodic TV with character development than it is like a season-long serialized arc, and why that's not a problem to fix, but a reality to hone. If you've been around, you know that I like to have a lot of continuity in my lessons, so it's not exactly that I'm really speaking to. This is more skill-based than thematic, which I guess I could have used a different example than theme, but you're with me. You're an English teacher too. So let me define what I mean by building up though. So in this case, what I'm thinking is that each lesson has to scaffold directly toward the next, like a serialized TV show where episode 1 sets up episode 2, which sets up episode 3. And then if you miss one, you're lost. And this would look like every text chosen prepares students for the next. So skills are taught in sequence: master A, then B, then C, then combine for the big finale. So in this case, there's this constant pressure, like this skill has to connect to that skill. Everything matters for the final product. And then students who miss one day genuinely feel lost because the whole structure depends on previous lessons. I think that we're missing something there, partly because we as English teachers are working on multiple skills at once. So to say that we can work so linearly is just like not realistic. But think about serialized TV like Lost, maybe. Brilliant show, but you can't just drop into episode 7 of season 3, right? Because you'll have no idea what's happening. The entire experience is dependent on that sequential viewing. But that's exactly what we're being asked to create in English classrooms, right? I mean, I know that what we're asked to do is like set a goal, have a learning target, and not to say that those things are wrong, but it just is not capturing the full experience of English because we are not working out on like, multiplication. We're not working on just like factoring like one thing at a time. So because you have to do a little bit of a spider web of information all the time. But even if we could, actually maybe because English doesn't work that way, trying to make it fit into this kind of like model is pretty exhausting for you and your students. We're being asked to fit our discipline into a model that doesn't necessarily want it. So I don't think that we've invented this pressure out of nowhere. It comes from a lot of places. It comes from this learning culture out of project-based learning that says everything needs to culminate in something big, like that season finale, the big reveal, you know? And also, I think it's a bit of a misunderstanding of backwards design in that every lesson has to build directly toward the final assessment. And while I do think in some ways we do want this, I'm not saying that we shouldn't backwards plan. We definitely should. But it's a oversimplification that we can choose one learning target and then follow that through, and then that will directly lead to that final assessment. Again, we're not math. Like, we're not going to say, okay, now I'm going to teach you how to do multiplication in various ways, or we're going to work on quadratic equations, so let's do some formative assessments around that. Like, it's not the same. So I think our essential questions do quite a bit of work in tying the whole season together, but we also have these pacing guides, which I don't know what your pacing guide looks like, but I will say that we do not have a pacing guide the same way that other disciplines do. And I think that makes sense. But people seem to forget that. I don't know if it's that nobody really looks at the English pacing guides when they build our professional development, but the assumption is that we're moving linearly through some kind of progression, and that's just really not the way that it works. And look, there's value in a lot of this, actually. And serialized TV can be incredibly compelling. Incredibly. Like, Breaking Bad is a masterpiece, right? It requires perfect conditions. So it requires that we are moving viewers along a specific path that they can binge when they need to, and that they have the capacity really to hold this complex narrative together across time. And when one thing disrupts that sequence, when someone misses an episode, or there's a 3-week gap between viewings, like, during winter holidays, the whole experience suffers, which maybe sounds familiar. But when we try to make English learning serialized, you have to carry the teacher, carry the weight of the entire narrative arc. And it means you can't be responsive because you'll mess up the progression. Which is why I think we feel sometimes so behind, because we have this expectation that we should be at a certain point, not just in a text, but at a certain point in learning at one point during the year. So it means that we're constantly managing these complex connections that students may not even see, and that, more importantly, administrators don't even see, but they have expectations that students should be at the same place. We've been talking a lot about how we can have a shared load of student skills in my school. And I think that part of what is challenging is the expectation that our students are all not our individual students are all the same, but our classes are all the same. And I will say that my classes from class to class look very different. Even all my honor students or all my English 10 students, and by students I mean classes. So trying to figure out what anyone needs at a given point is not a progression. Like, we're not going to say in September they're going to need to learn about literary devices, and then in October they're going to need to learn about semicolons. Even if that's what we teach, I think that that's not necessarily the way that we would want our students to maybe I don't know, like, go back to get triage. Like, if a student doesn't learn semicolons when I teach it, that's fine. Like, semicolons, I think, is a skill that they don't necessarily need at that time. So there's that. So I think if they don't understand something in one lesson, it just means that we can catch them in the next lesson. Like, everything feels high stakes because it all matters, but that's not necessarily the way that we want for our lessons to feel. But I think what's a problem is we pretend for everyone else that skills can be mastered in one episode and then checked off, and we create these artificial progressions that don't match how understanding actually develops. And then we lose what makes English unique in service of fitting that linear model of education. But Strange New Worlds helped me think through this a little bit because that episodic structure with character development isn't less sophisticated than serialized TV. It's just a different kind of sophisticated. And I think you need both. Like, you need that satisfaction of complete experiences and also the growth that happens over time. I think that English needs that too. So you might be wondering, don't we need clear and clean learning targets? Because I'm not advocating for aimless teaching. So let me be clear. In Strange New Worlds, they know where their characters are going, right? Captain Pike has an arc and the show has direction, but each episode is also a complete experience. And I think learning targets are like that character direction. They tell us where students are going, but they don't require every single lesson to build sequentially toward them. So, like, here's my learning target. Students will analyze how authors use literary devices to develop theme. So that doesn't change, like, it's clear, it's measurable, it's rigorous, but the path to that target doesn't have to be serialized. So it's not like identify literary devices, then identify theme, and then connect devices to theme. Because what we need, and then like assessing mastery, and then move to the next season. So like move on to the next skill. But this is really like complete experience with theme and short story, then theme in a poem, a different genre, complete experience with a theme in a novel, with a more like complicated, complex character. And then maybe complete experience with theme in a film, or, like whatever. I think you get what I'm saying. But then maybe what we do is we return to short stories at the end. So then we have the same destination, different structure. But even then, right, we can't, all short stories are not created equal as well. It's I don't know, it's just not the same, right? And in Strange New Worlds, Pike doesn't stop being a captain, right? Just because he's resolved the conflict in episode 3. He encounters new situations that require leadership throughout the season. And then we get to see different dimensions of him. And that's, I think, how English skills work. Students don't complete theme analysis in Unit 1. They encounter it repeatedly, and each time with more sophistication. I mean, we've talked a lot about schema building, and I think that's it. Like, the more that we can have students build sophistication, have that language to be able to go back to it, it helps them to understand and deepen what they think about different topics in the world. And I think here's what drives me crazy about mastery language in English. In serialized TV, you resolve plot points, right? Walter White either defeats Gus Fring or he doesn't. That conflict is done, checked off, we move to the next plot. But in episodic TV with character development, characters don't master being themselves and then move on, And Pike doesn't complete his leadership in episode 5, then the show is like, okay, leadership mastered, moving on to different character traits now. He keeps being a leader. He keeps encountering those different facets of leadership, and we keep understanding more about him. And that's what English skills are like. I mean, I've been teaching, this is my 18th year, and I have a degree in English. I read constantly, and I'm still noticing new things about, like, my example, how theme works, like how I can think about different themes in different ways. And I'm still developing as a reader and writer. Hardly any of our students are Hemingway or whoever. I mean, heck, hardly any of us are Hemingway. So when we tell a 16-year-old they need to master literary analysis by the end of the unit, we're saying you need to complete your character development by episode 4. And that's not how character development works. And that's not how English works. So, okay, like, I teach Macbeth every year for so long. This will be like my, I think, 15th year teaching Macbeth. I tried to count, but I don't remember what that number is. But some years I've had 5 sections of it, including this year and last year. So every single year, I noticed something new about that text. I mean, I had this idea about madness and how we can think about it in relationship to AI and how technology is imposed on us. So I think that's partly it. Like, we're a new person every time we come to it, so we can bring something new to the text. That's definitely not something I would have come up with 10 years. It wasn't even a thing. So, at least not in our world. So my character as a reader is still developing because I'm bringing in new information, thinking in different ways about how the text works and what Shakespeare is trying to do. when my students encounter symbolism in September and then encounter it again in November, they're not failing to resolve the symbolism plot line. They're just developing as readers. And I think that's exactly what's supposed to happen. We've taken that mastery language from subjects where it works, right? It works in other places where skills are plot points that get resolved. And then they've applied it to English where skills are character traits that keep developing. Like in math, you can resolve long division, I think. I'm not a math teacher, but you learn it, you practice it, and then you move on to the next plot point. And the skill is relatively stable. But in English, you don't resolve literary analysis. You keep being a literary analyst, encountering new texts and developing new sophistication. These aren't the same kind of learning. And when we pretend that they are, we get this really exhaustive cycle where students supposedly mastered something, but 3 months later can't do it. And we're told we didn't scaffold it properly. I mean, right? Like we say that. I'm sure you've seen this in the data, a student that can look at like symbolism, whatever, in one text and not be able to really work with it well in the next text. It's because like unlike numbers, literature is not the same across text to text. So every time they encounter something new, it's an opportunity to develop those skills. I was saying to my co-teacher the other day that I think really what we do, and I'll have to boil this down. I'm curious to see what you think that this is, but that we maybe teach 5 things over and over again in different ways. I think we could probably boil it down in that way. And I'm not thinking like reading, writing, communicating, that kind of thing. I'm thinking more like when we teach students writing, we're really trying to teach them how to take something that's narrow and apply it to something broader. Like that's one of the skills that I think that we're working on. But I think really there are just like a couple of those that we really hammer. Maybe if we got clear on what those things are in a different way, it might make this easier. I don't know. That was just a thought that's been rolling around. But I think here, when we're told, like someone else might look at that data when they look at like, okay, symbolism here, symbolism there, like why couldn't they continue to, or like they take your state test and it's like they miss a question on symbolism, like, oh, you didn't teach it. Like, no, that's not it. Like it depends, right? And we can say, I mean, students might forget, that's a thing too, but if their character in September was appropriate for September and their character in December is appropriately more sophisticated for December, that's not failure, that's development. And I think one thing that has made this really concrete for me is the NWA test. I don't know if your district uses it, but we do. And every time I look at those results, I feel this tension between what the data is telling me and what I know about how English actually works. And I wasn't really able to put my finger on it, but until recently, because here's how NWA structures the results. So students fall into a band. Let's say they get a RIT score, like RIT, 220 to 230. And according to the test, students in that band should be working on specific skills at specific levels. So theoretically, I could look at my class and say, okay, you 3 students are in the 220s, so you're working on identifying theme. You 4 are in the 230s, so you're working on analyzing how theme develops. And you 2 in the 230s, you're synthesizing multiple themes. And that's just not how English works, because like I have a student right now who can synthesize multiple themes in a novel we've spent 6 weeks with, but maybe struggles to identify a single theme in a short story they just read. It really depends on the context and maybe the scaffolding in the way that it's presented, or maybe the theme. Like, because when we're talking about this, like so much of reading in English is being able to put your own contextual knowledge on top of it and make sense of what you're reading. So maybe they have some strong contextual knowledge and they're able to bring that, whereas when we have another text, they're not. So a student can write a gorgeous thesis statement about character development, but can't maybe find solid textual evidence to support it. So when we look at them as a whole, we might say, oh, that student doesn't actually understand that character development, but that's not necessarily true. It could be textual evidence. And I know that you get what I'm saying, that we act like these skills work in isolation, but they don't. And then we get into the thing like a student can discuss something maybe orally with sophistication, but when they go down to write, they decide that they need to be a robot, both actually be a robot and that they don't do their work, but also maybe just write robotically. So, what's their RIT score supposed to tell me about their level? I think this model, this NWEA model, assumes that readers are progressing linearly, that it's a linear progression of those discrete skills like identify, analyze, evaluate, synthesize, like climbing a ladder one rung at a time. But English doesn't work that way. Not really. A student doesn't master that theme identification at level 3 and then move up to theme analysis at level 4 because they get that increasingly complex context. And sometimes they'll succeed, sometimes they'll struggle. And they gradually develop more sophisticated understanding. And which level they're at depends entirely on the text they're reading, whether it's poetry or prose, whether it's familiar or unfamiliar, and the context they're working in. Like, is it timed? Do they have extended discussion? Is this something that is similar to what they're doing in history? And also maybe the mode. Is it oral, written, individual, collaborative? How much background knowledge do they have? How developmentally ready are they for that particular complexity? And it could be like whether they're having a good day or a terrible one. And you can't really reduce that to a single number on a linear scale because what the testing model, but that's what the testing model requires because testing companies need clean data and administrators need trackable growth and clean data. So the system needs students to fit into boxes that are like below basic, basic, proficient, advanced, or whatever. So we get results that suggest English skills are linear when they're actually recursive. And it suggests students are at one level when they're actually at different levels simultaneously across different contexts. And I mean, honestly, I think that's why English is fun and why it's fun to teach. But what really frustrates me is we're asked to differentiate based on the levels of the test. So, like, okay, your 220 students need more scaffolding on theme identifications, and your 240 students need to do extension work on theme synthesis. But what I actually see in my classroom is that every student needs to encounter all of those. They need to encounter a theme in varied contexts, and every student benefits from opportunities to synthesize. So the difference isn't that some students get to skip identification and go straight to synthesis, or that they've already mastered that and they never have to identify again. Like, that doesn't make sense. I think it's just like some students get to sophistication faster in some context, and maybe all contexts, but it's not the same. And I think episodic structure really honors that because when we can look at that theme in short story, in October's poem, in November's novel, in January's film, then every student gets those multiple opportunities to develop understanding at whatever level they're ready for in that particular context. So some students will be sophisticated with the short story and struggle with a novel. It happens. But that's not some students being at level 3 and then going back to level 2 or them skipping to level 4. Like, that's just developing unevenly across varied contexts. And that's how brains work. And I think building out honors that reality, and building up based on those kind of NWEA bands doesn't. Which brings me to another assumption that building up makes, that students are at roughly the same point for all skills. And that's what the model of NWA suggests, that if I give you a RIT score, you can tell me what level that student is at across all reading skills. And like, that's not true. That's just not true. Because it assumes that students are at the same point in the series. If we go back to that metaphor, like we can say, going back to Strange New Worlds, different characters develop at different rates. Like, Ahura's communication skills are growing and Spock's emotional awareness is developing. La'an's trust in the crew is building. But we wouldn't say that they're all necessarily at that same point. And if we look at like Ahura's communication skills versus Spock's communication skills, they're at very different points, but we wouldn't say that all of their skills are within the same band, right? So, I don't know. It's just that not all characters' milestones are hit at the same time, and that's completely normal. So when we design curriculum that says unit 1, everyone does X, and then unit 2, everyone does Y, and we're like theme, then symbolism, we're assuming everyone is watching the same episode at the same time and at the same developmental level. And even if we were focusing on it that way, that's not necessarily the way that students are going to consume the information. They're not going to be like, okay, now I'm working on symbolism. I'm not going to pay attention to theme. Like you can't move on from being a reader. You can't complete being a writer. You only develop more sophistication in how you inhabit those identities. So I think that what we really need to think about is how this works in practice. So we don't just, teach textual evidence and then build on others' ideas. That doesn't work. We have to think about how we can present these out of order and still help students enjoy each episode, right? If you watch them in order, you'll see how like Pike develops as a leader across the season. So thinking about how we can have those complete experiences. And I think more important than that, helping students understand this, that they're all developing at different rates and we're looking at things in a different way than we would in math. Like we're not all working on factoring. I can't come up with more math examples, so should have taken some notes on this, but we might find that students are maybe even jumping levels. It doesn't mean necessarily that a student's like, if we're talking about discussion skills, that they're going to be like, okay, first what I'm going to do is I'm going to share